For 7 years, I thought I knew Clara better than anyone. We had this rhythm, you know? Life wasn't perfect, but it was ours. No big trips or fancy nights out. Just two people who understood each other, shared everything, and trusted one another. We had a routine. She worked her job, I worked mine. We spent weekends together, a bit of Netflix and takeout, maybe a night out here and there if we were feeling adventurous. Everything felt normal. Solid. Then something started to change. Slowly at first, like a small crack in a foundation you don't notice until it's too late. Clara's schedule started shifting. She'd stay late for work, and I'd come home to an empty house. The dinner plans she used to make seemed to disappear. She'd tell me about these dinners she was having with her coworkers, but I noticed I was never invited. Not once. The first time it happened, I thought maybe it was no big deal. Maybe she just needed time with her colleagues. But then it happened again. And again. And I started feeling, well, like I wasn't part of her world anymore. I tried asking her about it one night, casually. "Everything okay, Clara?" I said, sitting across from her at the kitchen table. I didn't want to make it obvious that something felt off, but she picked up on it right away. "Yeah, everything's fine," she replied a bit too quickly, like she was trying to convince herself. Her eyes flickered over to her phone, like she was just waiting for it to ring. "Work's just been a lot lately," she added, avoiding my gaze. I wasn't buying it. But I didn't push. At first, I told myself maybe I was just overthinking things. But that was before the perfume. Clara's scent had always been this soft floral thing, light and delicate. It was the smell I associated with her. The one I bought her for our anniversary 2 years ago. But one day, I came home to find her in the kitchen, and, Jesus, it hit me. She was wearing something completely different. This wasn't the perfume I knew. This was something bolder, richer, seductive even. It was the kind of fragrance that grabbed your attention. It was loud. It wasn't her. I didn't say anything at first. I didn't want to sound paranoid. But something about it stuck with me. Maybe it was just a new bottle she picked up. Maybe she liked it better than the old one. But deep down, I knew that perfume wasn't for me. It wasn't for us. It was for someone else. I didn't confront her right away. That wouldn't have done me any good. I knew I needed something more. Something that would make her feel the same unease I was feeling. I had to take control. I spent the next few days just sitting with that feeling, that heavy weight in my gut. Clara's behavior, the perfume, the late nights, it was all adding up, and I could feel the pieces falling into place. I had no proof. Not yet, anyway. But I knew something wasn't right. And I wasn't going to let her just keep spinning this web of lies around me. I decided I'd let her dig her own hole. Instead of confronting her head-on, I thought, why not make her feel the same paranoia I was starting to feel? Make her second-guess herself, doubt the things she'd been doing. I wanted her to crack. I wanted to see her squirm the way I had. The idea came to me one evening, as I was watching her get ready to go out again. Another dinner. Another work event that I wasn't invited to. She was in the bathroom, getting dressed. I could hear her applying that perfume again. It was almost like a signal, like she was preparing for a night that didn't include me. That's when I realized what I had to do. I went online, ordered a bottle of the same perfume, but I didn't stop there. I found a way to alter it, add a few ingredients, make it just off enough so that when she wore it, she'd start feeling, well, let's just say unsettled. I wasn't just looking to catch her. I was going to mess with her head. Make her question everything she was doing. I wasn't about to just be some victim here. The package came a few days later, and I went to work. I replaced her perfume with the altered version when she wasn't looking. It wasn't drastic. Just enough to make her wonder. I could already imagine her confusion as she sprayed it on in the morning, thinking it was the same scent she'd worn for years, but something would be off. The next time she wore it, I'd know. She wouldn't be able to hide what she was feeling. And when she did start to feel that knot of guilt, that creeping unease, that was when I'd make my move. I had to get the timing right. It was all about setting the stage. I wasn't going to confront her directly. Not yet. I'd do it when she was already on edge, when the cracks in her calm little world started showing. The stage was set. I had the perfume in place. Now, it was just a matter of waiting for her to fall into the trap. I couldn't wait for her to feel that first wave of uncertainty, that hint of doubt, every time she caught a whiff of the scent. It would be like a little time bomb going off in her mind. And when it did, I'd be ready. But I had to go further. I couldn't just stop with a perfume trick. If I was going to make her face what she'd done, I needed to bring the past back into the present. And that's when I decided to do something I knew would shake her to her core. I called Ethan. Ethan. I hadn't thought about him in years. Clara's ex. The one who had come into our lives, like a storm, and left just as quickly. I still remembered the way she talked about him back when we first met, how he was just some old friend from college, how she would brush off any mention of him as if he didn't matter anymore. But I knew better. I knew what had happened between them, long before I knew what it meant to truly trust someone. Clara had slept with Ethan during a rough patch in our early years of marriage, right after I had taken a job in another city. I hadn't known it at the time. She kept it quiet, swept it under the rug. But when I found out, it was like a bomb had gone off in our relationship. She'd begged for forgiveness, swore it was a mistake, that it didn't mean anything, and like an idiot, I believed her. We worked through it, or so I thought. But in the back of my mind, I always knew Ethan was a part of her past I'd never fully erased. So, when I decided to take control, I knew I couldn't just rely on the perfume. I had to bring Ethan back into her life. Not just as some ghost I kept in my head, but as a living, breathing reminder of what she'd done. I didn't need to humiliate her. No, I wanted to make her face her mistakes, to confront the one person she never expected to see again. I hadn't spoken to Ethan in years, but I still knew how to reach him. A quick search, and there he was, still living in the same town, working the same job. I knew he wouldn't turn me down. He'd never been one to shy away from drama, especially when it came to Clara. I sent him a message. It was simple but direct. It's time to bring things full circle. I want you to come to a dinner. I'll explain everything when you're here. Don't worry, you'll enjoy yourself. It took a few hours for him to reply. I could practically hear the smirk in his words. You got it, man. I'll be there. The plan was set. I'd bring him to the dinner, make sure Clara's closest friends were there to witness everything. There was no room for doubt. She'd have no choice but to face her past and the mess she'd made. I didn't tell Clara about Ethan. Why would I? It wouldn't make any sense to her. She'd never expect it, and that's what made it perfect. I knew she'd walk into that room with no clue that I'd been playing her all along. But the best part? The perfume. By the time she walked into that dinner, she'd already be feeling the weight of her lies, that uncomfortable, nagging sense that something was wrong. She'd already be unraveling, and I'd be there to make sure she couldn't hide from it any longer. The dinner was just a few days away, and I could feel the tension building. I didn't need to see her squirm to know that something was eating at her. I could sense it in the way she would glance at me, trying to act normal. But I knew. And the best part was, she didn't know that I knew. She was still under the illusion that she was in control, that her lies hadn't caught up to her. But they were about to. The day of the dinner came faster than I expected. My stomach was tied up in knots, a mix of anger and anticipation. I'd spent the morning making sure everything was perfect, the guest list, the food, the seating arrangements. I wasn't just setting up a dinner. I was setting a trap. I called Ethan earlier that day to confirm. You sure you're still in? I asked. He replied too quickly, like he was already enjoying the role I'd cast him in. I'm in, he said with that smug tone of his. It'll be fun. Can't wait to see how Clara reacts. I didn't like the idea of Ethan getting too comfortable, but I wasn't doing this for him. He was a tool, nothing more. He was going to be the catalyst for Clara's downfall, the one piece I needed to expose everything. I had to remind Clara of who she used to be, of the mistake she tried to bury. When Clara came home later that night, she seemed off. Distracted, her eyes flicking to her phone every few seconds, like she was waiting for something or someone. Everything okay? I asked, trying to sound casual, though I knew exactly why she was distracted. She shot me a smile that was too quick. Yeah, just work stuff. You know how it is, she said. clearly avoiding my gaze as she fidgeted with her clothes. The perfume. I could smell it immediately. It was that same bold scent, that new fragrance she'd been wearing lately. It wasn't her, and I knew exactly what it meant. She was already feeling it. The unease, the guilt. The doorbell rang. I opened it, and there was Ethan, looking way too comfortable. He greeted me with a handshake, like we were long-lost friends. "Ready for this?" he asked, grinning. I didn't smile back, but I nodded. "Let's get it over with." Clara emerged from the bedroom just as Ethan was hanging his coat. When she saw him, her face went pale. She froze, her breath hitching. "Ethan?" Her voice was shaky, confused. I stayed silent, watching. Ethan smirked, not missing a beat. "Guess she didn't know I was coming. But hey, we'll make this a night to remember." Clara looked between us, clearly thrown off. What are you doing here?" she stammered. I didn't answer. I just let the weight of the moment sink in. Her past was standing in front of her, and there was no escaping it. Ethan shrugged, clearly enjoying himself. "You didn't mention me? Guess I'm here to make sure you don't forget." Clara struggled to find her words, her composure slipping. She was shaking, trying to hold it together, but I could see it. The crack in the mask. She was crumbling from the inside out. "You've got a lot to explain, Clara," I said, watching her fall apart. The perfume, Ethan, the lies. Everything was coming back to haunt her. Her hand trembled as she reached for her glass of wine, but she didn't drink. She was too busy staring at Ethan, her mind racing, trying to figure out how to handle the mess she'd created. I let the silence hang in the air, knowing that she couldn't run from this. She couldn't run from me. The tension in the room was unbearable. Clara was frozen, her mind struggling to process what was happening. Ethan, sitting back with a smug grin, made it clear he wasn't here to help her. I, on the other hand, was just waiting for her to break. She tried to pull herself together, clearing her throat. "Ethan, I didn't know you were coming. I thought you were out of town." Her voice was high, strained, like she was scrambling to figure out what to say. Ethan smirked. "Guess I'm back now. Funny, I thought we'd be catching up, but it seems like there's more to talk about than I expected." He glanced at me, like we were in on some private joke. Clara's face tightened, but she couldn't hide the panic creeping into her eyes. She looked at the floor, then back at Ethan, clearly rattled. "What do you mean?" Her voice was shaky. I leaned forward, eyes fixed on her. "Funny how you never mentioned Ethan when you'd talk about those work dinners," I said casually. Clara flinched. Her eyes darted from Ethan to me, and I could see the shift in her, her carefully built walls starting to crumble. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. The silence between us was suffocating. "You think I didn't notice?" I continued, my voice calm, but cutting through the room. "Late nights, secrets, and now Ethan? You've been lying to me for weeks." Her face drained of color. She was visibly panicking, her composure cracking with every word. Her hands shook as she reached for her wineglass, but she didn't drink. It was like she was trying to hold herself together, but she couldn't. Ethan leaned in, enjoying the moment. "Clara, you always thought you could pretend nothing happened between us. But I didn't forget." Clara's eyes snapped to him, her shock evident. I could see the guilt flooding her face, the realization that her past was slapping her in the face. I didn't," she stammered, but the words were jumbled. She wasn't even making sense anymore. I stayed calm, but there was an edge to my voice. "It's over, Clara. You don't get to hide anymore. You don't get to lie your way out of this." The room fell silent. Clara stood there, shaking, trying to gather herself, but she couldn't. The weight of her lies was too much. Her eyes were wide, and her lips trembled as she looked at me, helpless. For the first time, I saw Clara for what she really was. Vulnerable, broken, exposed. Her mask had slipped, and she had nowhere left to hide. She was finally facing the consequences of her actions. I didn't need to say anything else. The guilt was written all over her face. She was done. Clara's face was a mess of emotions. Fear, guilt, confusion. It was like I was watching the layers of her carefully built persona peel away, leaving nothing but the raw truth underneath. She couldn't hide anymore. The weight of her lies, the perfume, Ethan sitting right there, it was too much. She had no escape. Her hands were shaking so badly that I thought she might drop her wine glass. She put it down quickly, her eyes darting around the room, desperate for something to hold on to. "This isn't what it looks like," she said, her voice trembling. I almost laughed. "Really? Because it looks pretty damn clear to me." She opened her mouth to say something, but then just closed it again, like she realized there was nothing left to say. Nothing that would make this go away. She wasn't prepared for this. She thought she could get away with it, that I wouldn't notice. But now, here we were, and there was no turning back. Ethan leaned forward, clearly enjoying the spectacle. "Clara, you're really not even going to try and explain yourself?" he asked, his voice almost mocking. Clara shot him a glance, but she couldn't even look him in the eye for more than a second. Her chest was rising and falling rapidly, like she was gasping for air. I didn't mean to hurt you," she said to me, her voice cracking. I was confused, okay? I didn't know what to do. It was just a mistake. It didn't mean anything." Her words were coming out in a rush, each one sounding more desperate than the last. But none of them were convincing. They were empty. She had betrayed me, and now she was scrambling to put everything back together. I couldn't even look at her for a moment. The pain was too fresh, too raw. "A mistake?" I repeated, my voice low. "You don't sleep with someone by accident, Clara. You don't lie to me for weeks and call it a mistake." She flinched at the words, but the guilt was too much for her to hide. I could see the tears welling up in her eyes, but she wiped them away before they could fall, like she was trying to hold on to some last shred of dignity. But it was too late. She wasn't the woman I thought I married anymore. She wasn't the woman I trusted. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words barely audible. "I'm so sorry. I never wanted to hurt you." I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. I wasn't angry anymore. I was beyond that. I was just done. The silence in the room was suffocating, and Clara seemed to shrink under the weight of it. Then, Ethan spoke up again. "You've got a real talent for saying the right things when you need to, don't you, Clara? But it's a little too late for that now, don't you think?" Clara's eyes flicked to him, but she didn't say anything. She couldn't. There was nothing left for her to say. The room felt like it was closing in on her, and I could see it, the moment when everything finally shattered for her. She was broken, and there was no putting the pieces back together. Not now. Not after everything she'd done. "Clara," I finally said, my voice steady but firm. "It's over." She looked at me, her eyes wide, her face pale, but there was nothing left to fight for. Nothing she could do to fix it. The silence that hung in the room was suffocating. Clara's eyes were locked on me, her body rigid, like she was trying to hold on to some sense of control, but I could see it, she was losing the battle. The guilt and fear were overwhelming her, and there was nothing left for her to hide behind. She opened her mouth again, but no words came out. She was shaking, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She looked over at Ethan, but even he wasn't offering any help. He was just watching, enjoying the show like a spectator at a game. He wasn't here to comfort her. He was just another part of the mess she'd made. I stood up, the tension in my body easing just a little as I moved closer to her. I didn't want to see her cry. I didn't want to hear her apologies. I just wanted to be done with all of it. "You think you can just apologize and everything will be okay?" I said, my voice tight. "You can't fix this, Clara. You've broken something that can't be put back together." Her eyes started to well up, but she didn't speak. She couldn't. There was no point in trying to make things right anymore. The truth was out, and there was no unringing that bell. Ethan, clearly enjoying the awkwardness of it all, leaned back in his chair, stretching out like he was settling in for a long evening. "You know, I've never understood why you guys always act like everything's fine. You both know the truth, but you act like you're fine. It's kind of pathetic, actually." He glanced over at Clara with a smirk. "You were never really honest with him, were you?" Clara shot him a look that could have burned a hole through him, but she couldn't even summon the energy to argue. She knew he was right. "I never meant for any of this to happen," she whispered, finally speaking again. Her voice was barely above a breath. Broken. I didn't want to hurt you. You did, I cut her off, my voice sharp. And it doesn't matter how many times you apologize. It's not going to change what you did. She flinched at my words, but she didn't argue. There was no defense, no excuse that could fix this. She was out of words, out of ways to make it better. I looked at her one last time, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. But that moment passed quickly. She had made her choices, and now she had to live with the consequences. I think it's time for you to leave, I said, my tone leaving no room for discussion. Clara didn't move at first. She looked at me like she was waiting for some kind of sign, some hint that I was still the man she thought I was. But I wasn't. I wasn't that person anymore. I'm done, Clara, I said quietly. I can't do this anymore. Her face crumpled, and for a split second, I thought she might try to beg or plead with me. But instead, she just stood up, her shoulders slumped. Without a word, she turned and walked out the door, her footsteps echoing in the quiet of the house. I didn't stop her. I didn't need to. She was already gone. The door closed behind her with a finality that echoed in my chest. I stood there for a moment, just listening to the sound of her footsteps fading away down the hall, down the stairs, out the door. The house felt empty, quieter than it had ever been. I couldn't say I felt relief. It wasn't like a weight was lifted off my shoulders. It was more like the calm after a storm, quiet, but heavy, as if the air still held the remnants of what had just happened. I walked back to the kitchen, grabbed a drink, but the glass sat in my hand like a useless object. Nothing felt real anymore. I didn't want to talk to anyone. I didn't want to explain myself, not to Ethan, not to any of Clara's friends, not to anyone. What could I say? That I finally saw her for who she really was? That I wasn't shocked, but I was still wrecked by it? What good would any of that do? Ethan was still there, lounging on the couch, sipping his drink like we hadn't just witnessed the slow destruction of a marriage. I could feel his eyes on me, waiting for some kind of response, a thank you, maybe, or at least some acknowledgement that his role in all this had been helpful. But I couldn't give him that. He was just another part of the mess. A tool. Nothing more. You got what you wanted, he said after a while, breaking the silence. She's gone. Now what? I didn't respond. I didn't need to. He was just waiting for me to crumble, for me to show that I was affected by Clara's leaving, by the way things had ended. But I wasn't going to give him that satisfaction. Are you going to stay here all night? I asked, finally turning to face him. Ethan shrugged, a little too comfortable in my space. I'm not in a hurry to leave, if that's what you're asking. I exhaled sharply, pushing the words out. Well, I am. You can either leave, or I'll make you leave. Your choice. It wasn't even a threat. It was just the truth. I had no time for small talk, no time for the usual games. Clara had already taken everything she was going to take, and now I was left with the mess. I didn't need Ethan's smug presence dragging it out. For a moment, Ethan didn't move, like he was testing me, seeing if I'd back down. But I didn't. After a long beat, he stood up, his grin fading. All right, man. You're right. I'll head out. But don't get too used to being alone. It's hard, right? I didn't answer. I just watched him walk out the door, his footsteps following Clara's down the hall. And when it was finally just me, alone in the silence, I sat back down at the table and let the weight of it all hit me. I was done. It wasn't just Clara I had lost. It was the person I used to be. The trust, the belief that people were capable of change, of honesty. It was all gone now. And what did I have left? A broken house, an empty space, and the pieces of a life I couldn't put back together. But I wasn't going to chase after her. I wasn't going to beg for closure or an explanation. She'd already given me everything I needed to know. I wasn't the man she had married anymore. And now, neither was she. The days after Clara left were a blur of numbness. I went through the motions, but nothing felt real. I wasn't really living. I was just existing. Work felt like a distraction, but it didn't fill the empty space. Coming home to the quiet house was the worst part. It was like a constant reminder that everything had changed, and I couldn't undo it. I avoided her friends, at least the ones who were still in touch with me. I didn't want their sympathy, didn't need it. They had all been in the dark, just like me. If anything, they had been part of the illusion I'd let myself believe. I had to cut ties with them too. Ethan called a couple of times, but I didn't pick up. There was nothing more to say. If I didn't want to hear from Clara anymore, I definitely didn't want to hear from him. He was just a reminder of how far off track everything had gone. It was like there was a before and an after, and the before seemed like someone else's life. I couldn't even remember what it felt like to be that guy, the one who trusted, the one who believed in the idea of a marriage that didn't end up shattered by betrayal. I don't know what I was expecting from Clara, if I'm honest. Some grand apology? A heartfelt, I messed up and I want to fix it? She hadn't even tried to reach out. The silence from her side was deafening, but in some way, it was also easier. It was confirmation that I wasn't waiting on something that wasn't going to come. I was still angry, but at least I had clarity. I remember the first time I heard someone say her name after everything happened. It was one of my co-workers, passing by the break room. She mentioned Clara in some casual way, like it was just another normal conversation. I could feel the anger rise in my chest, but I held it in. There was no point in dragging it out with strangers. But inside, it hit me. I wasn't hurt anymore. Not the way I thought I would be. I was pissed. Furious. And I knew, deep down, I didn't need Clara to get closure. I had it already. I'd spent so long focusing on what she had done to me, but it was only when I stopped thinking about her, when I let go of whatever lingering attachment I'd been holding onto, that I started seeing things differently. What had I really lost? A relationship? Sure. A person I thought I knew? Absolutely. But what I hadn't lost was myself. I hadn't lost my ability to move forward. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of something. Something I hadn't felt in a long time, hope. Not because I thought Clara would come back or that we could somehow rebuild what we'd had, but because I could rebuild myself. I wasn't going to be the victim anymore. I wasn't going to let the anger eat me up. Not forever. I'd made sure of that. Clara's betrayal wasn't going to define me. It wasn't going to drag me under. I had my life to live, and it was time to get back to it. It was going to take time. A lot of time. But I was ready to move on. The road ahead wasn't clear yet, but at least I could see the direction I needed to go. And that felt like a small victory in itself. It's funny how fast life moves once you stop looking back. At first, I thought the silence would consume me. That the emptiness left in the wake of Clara's departure would swallow everything up, and I'd be stuck in that broken chapter of my life forever. But somehow, over time, it didn't. The first few weeks were rough, no question. There were moments when I'd catch myself reaching for the phone to text her or find myself staring at the empty side of the bed. There were moments when I was driving to work and her favorite song would come on the radio, and I'd have to pull over because the lump in my throat was too much to swallow. I'd always thought I'd be the kind of guy who could just pick up the pieces and move on, but it wasn't that simple. It wasn't easy. But you know what? Slowly, I started feeling different. I started getting used to being alone. Not lonely, just alone. And for the first time, I could hear my own thoughts clearly again. The noise in my head, the guilt, the confusion, started to fade. It was like I was finding my rhythm again, the one I had before Clara, before all the lies, before the betrayal. I started taking care of myself. Physically and mentally. I wasn't about to let her actions define who I was going to become. So I hit the gym again. I spent time with friends who actually had my back, who didn't judge me or look at me like I was some broken person. I reconnected with hobbies I'd pushed aside for years, like photography and hiking, things that made me feel like me again. One weekend, I took a trip up to the mountains by myself. I had no real destination, just a small cabin I rented off some website, and the intention to get out of my own head. And it worked. The views were incredible. The air was crisp. And for the first time in a long time, I felt free. Like I could breathe again, like I wasn't carrying the weight of Clara's betrayal on my shoulders. It was like the world was giving me permission to let go. I'd like to say I don't think about her at all anymore. That's not true. But when I do, it's not with the same anger. It's not with the same heartbreak. It's more like a faint echo of something that's long past, a memory I don't need to revisit to know the lesson it taught me. I remember talking to one of my close friends a few months after she left. He asked me how I was doing, and for the first time, I didn't feel like I was lying when I said, "I'm good." "I've got a new perspective," I told him. "I'm not the same guy I was, but in a way, I think I'm better for it." It wasn't about forgiveness. I didn't need that. It was about realizing that I could still move forward. That Clara's actions didn't dictate my future. I could choose how I wanted to feel, how I wanted to live. I could choose me. The road ahead wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was mine. And I wasn't going to let anyone, not even Clara, take that from me. I'm not sure what the future holds. Maybe I'll meet someone new. Maybe I won't. But whatever happens, I know now that I'm not defined by what I've been through. I'm defined by how I choose to rise above it. And right now, I'm choosing to move forward. The months after Clara left passed by in a haze, and slowly, I started to feel like I was living again. The weight of the past was still there, but it wasn't pressing down on me the way it had. I wasn't fully free, but I was starting to breathe. I was finding a new rhythm, one that didn't depend on anyone else to feel complete. The house felt different. Quieter, of course, but not as lonely as I thought it would be. There was space to think, space to just be. I could leave the dishes in the sink or watch whatever I wanted on TV without feeling like I had to compromise. Small things, but they made a difference. For the first time in a while, I started to appreciate being alone, even if it wasn't what I'd wanted at first. Work became a welcome distraction. I wasn't using it to avoid my problems, but it was fulfilling. I'd found my focus again, something I hadn't realized I'd lost while trying to hold everything together with Clara. And while there were still moments when the anger or sadness would creep in, they didn't consume me anymore. I could handle it now. One Saturday, I ran into one of Clara's old co-workers, Sarah, at the grocery store. We exchanged pleasantries, and when she asked about Clara, I could see the pity in her eyes. I hated that look. It felt like people were expecting me to be a mess. "Clara's not around anymore," I said, keeping it short. "She's moved on." Sarah hesitated, like she was about to say more, but I cut her off. "I'm fine." "Really?" She nodded, but I could tell she wasn't convinced. I didn't need her sympathy. I didn't need anyone's validation. As Sarah left, I stood in the aisle, pushing my cart, and realized something. I didn't have to explain myself anymore. I wasn't broken. I was fine, more than fine. I was finding my way, and that was enough. Later that night, I made myself dinner, took my time with it, and didn't rush. I poured a glass of wine and sat at the table, enjoying the quiet. It felt like freedom, like I was starting to take control back of my life. I thought about Clara, about the last time we were together, the way she begged for forgiveness. But that was in the past now, and it didn't hurt the way it used to. I didn't need closure from her. I didn't need to forgive her. I had done the hardest part. I had let go. And with that, I had found peace. It wasn't about forgetting what happened. It was about accepting it and moving forward. Tomorrow, I'd wake up and keep going, not knowing exactly where I was headed, but not stuck anymore. And for now, that was enough. Time moved on, and with it, I found a new rhythm. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. I stopped looking over my shoulder at the past, stopped waiting for something to pull me back into the mess Clara left behind. Life had a way of pushing forward whether we were ready or not, and for the first time, I wasn't resisting it. I was learning to embrace it. I started going out more, reconnecting with friends I hadn't seen in a while. I'd forgotten what it was like to have real, genuine conversations. No tension, no pretending to be fine when I wasn't. We laughed, we drank, and I realized I'd missed this part of myself. The part that didn't feel like it was always carrying someone else's weight. The part that had gotten lost in the blur of my marriage. I also started doing things for me again. Little things, like taking that solo trip to the beach I'd always put off, or signing up for that photography class I'd wanted to try. I wasn't just filling the void left by Clara anymore. I was finding pieces of myself that had been buried under all the stress and the hurt. It wasn't easy, of course. Some days, the memories would creep in. Good ones and bad ones. I'd find myself remembering things I used to love doing with Clara, and for a split second, I'd wonder how things would have turned out if she hadn't lied, if she hadn't chosen someone else over me. But those thoughts didn't have the same grip on me anymore. I'd let them come, and then I'd let them go. I was finally starting to take control of my thoughts, not the other way around. One weekend, I decided to take a day trip to a hiking trail I'd been eyeing for a while. It wasn't too far from home, but it was the kind of place where you could lose yourself in nature, away from everything else. I packed my gear, took a deep breath as I stood at the trailhead, and started walking. The quiet was almost overwhelming at first, but then, slowly, I started to enjoy it. The hike was tough in places, but I pushed through. And when I reached the summit, standing there, looking out over the valley, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: accomplishment. Not because I had conquered the trail, but because I had conquered something deeper. The hurt. The uncertainty. I had made it to the other side. And I was okay. It wasn't about forgetting or erasing the past. It was about moving forward despite it. Clara's betrayal had been a chapter of my life, but it didn't define me anymore. I was more than that. I didn't know where the future would take me, whether I'd meet someone new, or if I'd keep walking this path on my own. But for the first time in a long time, I felt ready. I was ready for whatever came next. And that, in itself, felt like the greatest victory. Months passed, and something inside me shifted. The pain from Clara's betrayal had faded into something less sharp, more like a scar, a reminder of what I had been through, but no longer something that controlled me. The anger had dulled, and in its place was a quiet understanding that life had a way of moving forward, whether we were ready or not. I was starting to realize that I didn't need closure from her. I didn't need an apology or some grand declaration of regret. What I needed was to let go of the idea that my happiness was tied to her, to our past. It was hard, but I was finally starting to see that. I was beginning to rediscover who I was without the weight of Clara's lies hanging over me. For the first time in years, I felt like I was living for me again. Not as someone's husband, not as someone defined by betrayal, but as someone who could still find joy in the small things. I started to embrace the life I had, instead of the one I thought I had lost. I spent more time with friends, not out of obligation, but because I genuinely enjoyed their company. We went on random road trips, hit up new bars in the city, and talked about anything and everything. The laughter was effortless. It wasn't just a distraction from the past, it was living, something I hadn't done in a while. One evening, I bumped into an old friend from college, a woman I hadn't seen in years. Her name was Kate, and she had always been someone I'd admired, though nothing ever came of it back then. We started talking, and it felt so natural, like no time had passed. She had that same easy smile, the one that made everything feel lighter. We exchanged numbers, and over the next few weeks, we texted, then met for coffee, then drinks. There was no pressure, no expectation. It was just two people getting to know each other, sharing stories and laughs. And in that simple act of getting to know someone, I realized something I hadn't expected. I wasn't scared anymore. I wasn't scared to open up again, to trust again. I didn't know where things would go with Kate, and I wasn't rushing into anything. But I realized that there were possibilities ahead of me, things I hadn't thought about in a long time. It felt good to have that hope again, to think that I wasn't just walking through life alone, but that there was the chance for something new. For the first time in a while, I allowed myself to feel excited for the future. Not because I was trying to forget Clara or replace her, but because I had finally started living again. I had moved on, not just from the marriage, but from the version of me who thought my happiness depended on someone else's choices. I was free. Free to choose, free to grow, and free to build something that was entirely mine. And as I stood there talking to Kate, I realized that whatever came next, whatever life threw at me, I was ready for it. It wasn't until one quiet evening, months after Clara had left, that I truly understood what moving on really meant. Up until that point, I had been going through the motions of healing, of rebuilding. But this night felt different. It wasn't about getting over what had happened to me, it was about fully releasing it. I was sitting in the living room, sipping my beer, scrolling through my phone absent-mindedly. I came across an old picture of Clara and me, taken at a party years ago. It was one of those moments when everything felt perfect, before I knew about Ethan, before the lies started stacking up. For a brief second, I almost felt something. A tug at my chest. But it wasn't pain anymore. It was just nostalgia. I stared at the photo longer than I intended, thinking about the life we'd shared. But then, something shifted inside me. I didn't need to hold on to that image of who we had been. The life we built was gone, and with it, the person I was when I was with her. I couldn't go back. And I didn't want to. I put the phone down, set the beer on the table, and walked outside to the small balcony. The city was quiet, and for the first time in a while, I felt completely at peace. The weight of the past, the hurt, the betrayal, had finally melted away. It wasn't that I didn't care anymore, or that it didn't matter. It was just that it no longer defined me. I didn't need her to validate my worth. I didn't need to hold on to memories of what was broken. For the first time, I realized how much energy I had spent over the years trying to fix something that was never going to be fixed. I sat there for a while, letting the cool evening air settle around me, and I thought about what I really wanted moving forward. I wasn't waiting for Clara to come back, or for some magic moment where everything suddenly made sense. What I needed was to accept that things had ended, that the version of me I used to be was gone, and that was okay. The next morning, I made a decision. I was going to finally get rid of the things I'd been holding on to. Old gifts, cards, things I kept around, hoping I could somehow preserve a past that was slipping away. I spent the day clearing out the closet, the drawers, the shelves. It wasn't about punishing myself or erasing Clara from my life. It was about making room for what was next. I packed everything up and took it to a donation bin. The only things I kept were the things that really mattered, the ones that had nothing to do with her. It wasn't dramatic, but it felt huge. It felt like I was stepping into a new life, finally unburdened by the past. I didn't need to look back anymore. Later that evening, I called Kate. We hadn't spoken for a couple of days, but I was thinking about her, about the easy way we'd fallen into conversation, the natural way we'd shared our lives without rushing. We didn't talk about anything deep. We didn't have to. But when she laughed at something I said, I realized something. I was ready for this. Whatever it turned into. I was ready to let someone new in, to not be afraid of the future. It wasn't about forgetting Clara. It was about creating space for something real and genuine again. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel scared of what was next. Because I was finally free. Life has a way of surprising you when you least expect it. I'd gotten so used to the quiet, to the space I had carved out for myself, that I stopped thinking about what might come next. I wasn't waiting for anything. I was content. But that Sunday afternoon, life decided to throw me a curveball. I was sitting in my favorite cafe, enjoying a coffee and reading a book, when the door opened. I heard the chime of the bell and barely looked up. Then, a voice I knew all too well stopped me cold. "Excuse me, do you mind if I sit here?" I looked up, and there she was, Clara. She looked different. Tired, a little worn, but still so familiar. I felt my heart rate quicken. All the old emotions, anger, hurt, confusion, rushed back. But before they could take over, I reminded myself, I had already let go of this. I didn't need to get pulled back in. "Sure," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "Go ahead." Clara sat down across from me, and for a long moment, neither of us spoke. There was no hostility, but it wasn't comfortable either. We both knew something had been left unfinished, but neither of us knew how to start. "I didn't expect to see you here," Clara said softly, almost awkwardly. "Yeah, I come here sometimes," I replied, not offering much more. There was no need to dig into the past. She nodded, her eyes looking into her coffee. "I've thought a lot about everything. About what happened. About how it ended." I stayed quiet, letting her talk, but not letting her draw me back into the pain. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she continued. "I don't know if I can forgive myself. But I wanted to say, I'm sorry. I don't know how else to say it." Her voice broke a little. I took a deep breath. This was the moment I had been preparing for, but I wasn't about to let it change me. I didn't need her apology, but I wasn't going to shut it down either. "I know," I said simply. "And I'm sorry too. I'm sorry for letting it go on as long as it did." Her eyes widened, surprised by my response. But I didn't say more. I wasn't offering her forgiveness, just acknowledging that we both had our part to play in what happened. I think we both learned something, I added, my voice steady. But I've moved on. I'm not the same person I was when you left. She looked down at her hands, a slight nod. She didn't have an answer to that. I wasn't angry anymore, and I wasn't looking for closure. I'd already let go of all the hurt. After a few moments, Clara stood up, hesitating. I guess this is goodbye then, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Yeah, I replied, standing with her. I think it is. She gave me one last look, soft, almost sad, and then walked out. I didn't feel the old ache, the need to chase after her. I just felt calm, at peace. I finished my coffee, paid the bill, and left the cafe. Life was still ahead of me, and I was ready for whatever came next. I had let go completely, and for the first time, I knew I was free.